I'm excited to be here. I'm sure you're wondering why an entertainment person is talking to a financial regulator. Um, that's because you're talking about innovation, applying technology to do new things. And to my mind, that's a fundamentally creative process. I know we use the words ingenuity and innovation and so forth, inventions. Those are safe words to use. But the fact is, what you're going to do today in the next 3 days is very creative. And it's not just creative solo. You're doing this in a team-based way. Can you do me a favor and bring up the slides, please? So I'm going to talk to you today about collaborative creativity. Oh, great. There it is. Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about the process of collaborative creativity. And believe it or not, there is a process. It's actually something you can manage. It's something that people like me do every single day. There are tools and techniques that are useful for that. And I've been using these my entire career. So I'm going to share with you some of my favorite tips and tools and techniques today. And I want you to remember as we proceed, this is more than a hackathon. Hackathon, you kind of hack out an idea. This is different. It's a create-a-thon, right? So at the core, it's about creative application of new technologies. That's a really big step. And I salute you for doing it. I salute your management for organizing this event and having such success over the years. On average, something like one or maybe two of the projects, of the 28 projects here, are actually going to turn into an R&D program, right? So an R&D initiative. That's a really good likelihood of success. That's a really good likelihood that what you develop here is going to turn into a real world impact. And that means that you're really going to do more than come up with a bunch of ideas. You actually have an opportunity to change the organization, to change the tools that the organization uses. And of course, the tools shape our behavior. So by building better tools for FINRA, you are actually going to change the way FINRA operates. And let me add one more thought here. By embarking on a creative project, you're also taking a risk. Creativity is a risky proposition. It's a risky profession. You might be wrong. And by definition, when you create something, you're doing something that no one else has ever done before, right? And you might be wrong. That's a big risk. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about creating a culture where failure is not such a bad thing, because if you're trying to do new things, you'll begin to understand failure is part of the process. That's how we learn. So if you make a mistake or if your project doesn't work out as you hoped, that's okay, because presumably you've learned something from the process, and maybe the organization has as well. Now probably you're thinking, well, who is this guy? Rob. Hi, Rob. Nice to meet you all. As your CIO just mentioned, I've been doing this for about 30 years. I've been in the process of inventing stuff that never existed. I've done it all over the world. I've done it in Asia and in Europe. I've done it in North America and South America. And I've had the opportunity to work with a number of really cool companies on building things that never existed before. So that means we sit down in a room like this, and we do a process very much like the process you're going to do until we get to a plan. And then we build it. And sometimes we get it wrong. I'm not going to guarantee you that every single time it works. That's part of the risk. Now, along the way, I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing companies. Major motion picture studios, TV companies, some of the largest technology companies in the world, telecom companies. And as Eric mentioned, the technologies that you're grappling with right now, the ones you're going to work with this week, they are wreaking havoc in these industries. They are transforming these industries. They're causing these famous companies to react. Instead of being able to act proactively and set forth the strategy, they're now finding they're on the receiving end of transformational technology. They don't necessarily have a plan. That's particularly true of the media companies, but it's equally true for game industry companies, and I'd argue telecom as well. So starting with digitization, the process of replacing physical stuff with software, that wreaked havoc in the media and advertising businesses. It also transformed our telecom networks in the process by driving demand in different ways, particularly to mobile devices. And then the cloud. And the cloud is a major transformation. It hasn't completed yet. We're still in the process of migrating to the cloud. Now, these companies that I've worked with in the past, many of them have managed to find their path through, and they're still navigating a path through. But the new generation of technologies that's facing us now, particularly generative artificial intelligence, presents a novel set of challenges, particularly for the creative industry. They're on the receiving end, and in many cases, they're reactive to this. And so some of the experience that I have there, I'll share with you how we would navigate around that. How do we talk about these things? How do we find a program or strategy or even a plan to address them? So trying to advance my slides here. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing. Can you do that for me? Oh, great. Okay, good. Thanks. So what you want to try to do is stack the odds in your favor. In the advertising business, they have a phrase, they're in the business of generating ideas on demand, right? And so that's a very difficult proposition. Every day you show up at work and you're judged by how much creativity you generated. If you think about it, like if you're having a bad day or an off day or a tough week, or you're facing so much difficulty in your personal life, it can be kind of hard to do ideas on demand. So some of the techniques I'm going to share with you are addressed specifically to that kind of a challenge. But the main thing in the advertising world is the best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas. Because even if you have like one good idea, here's the problem. There might be circumstances outside your control that are going to make it impossible to execute. It might not cost, the cost of it might be too high. The implementation might be too complex. The market might not be ready for it. There are a lot of reasons why a good idea might not be ready for today. But the best way to deal with that is to have many good ideas. And so as you brainstorm, I know some of the groups here have started to identify problems. You arrived at this kind of ready to start to build. But I'm going to urge you to think through the problem a little bit differently so that you can really address the real problem. So it's hard to have good ideas if you're not in the right frame of mind. It can be really challenging. I don't know the culture of FINRA at all, but I deal with some pretty intense people at some pretty intense companies, very often at the CEO level of the company. These are decision makers. They don't tolerate indecision. They don't tolerate creative cycles so much. They certainly don't tolerate failure. And so they can create an atmosphere that's very difficult for creative people to thrive in. Here's a few thoughts. First one is it's hard to have good ideas if you're sitting at your desk, or frankly, if you're sitting down at all. Move around, get up, walk around, go outside, talk to a customer, talk to each other. But don't just sit in front of your desk. You know that old statement, the people who created the problem can't solve the problem. Well, it's also true that if you're sitting in the same place doing the same thing, you're not going to think of something new. You're going to think of the same things that you always do. So change your body position, change where you are, open yourself up. Very often people get the best ideas when they're moving, they're walking, when they're working with their hands. You know, one of the things a lot of CEOs have in common is that they have a hobby where they work with their hands. So what you want to do is kind of shift the modality of thinking from highly analytic, staring at a digital screen, to something where you're maybe doing something very tactile and very physical. It runs the ideas through different motor centers of the brain. It can free you up and help you focus differently. It's also difficult to have good ideas in isolation. We often think of that creative genius who's locked away in an attic garret generating great poetry or something, writing a great screenplay. Actually, it's not true. If you noticed that recently in the writers' strike that there was in Los Angeles and New York, writers work in teams. It's also true in advertising. They work in teams. And the reason you work in teams is that there's somebody there to be a reality check. You bounce ideas off of each other. Often, if you do it right, you can build the ideas up. I'll tell you how to do that, how to build on each other's ideas in a constructive way. And one last thought here. It's very hard to have good ideas if you're in a poisoned atmosphere. And I find often there are organizations that I have to work with where the atmosphere isn't quite right. There's a lot of pressure, top-down hierarchy that's expecting certain results, demanding certain results, or has a lot of rules around what kinds of results are possible or acceptable. Now, you're not going to generate good ideas if you're in a bad mood or if you're depressed or anxious. You can't. Huge challenge to do that. But you're also not going to generate good ideas if you feel insecure. So an environment where there's a lot of pressure can cause some people to shut down. In other words, now I'm speaking to the managers here, if you create pressure to perform, you actually might impact performance in a negative way. You have to be really careful with the creative process. Ideas are fledgling things, right? They're like little baby birds. They can't quite fly yet. If you put too much pressure on them, they're going to fail completely. You have to give them a little room to foster, grow. And the last thing is intimidation doesn't work. Certainly in the advertising business, it was quite common to be in environments where you're bullied. Frankly, you're bullied into creativity. This is not a very productive approach. People who are bullied tend to shut down and they get defensive. You can't be open to ideas. Creativity requires a certain amount of vulnerability. And the ideas, as I mentioned, the ideas are not fully baked yet. So they're not really ready for the kind of scrutiny that we would often apply to, say, a new business concept or a new business plan. They're a little premature for that. Give them a little room to grow. Give them a little room to grow and prosper. Okay, now I'm going to share with you a whole bunch of techniques that we use in the creative industries to generate ideas on demand in a group. This is collaborative creativity. And to do that, I'm going to encourage you to invoke a persona, to actually get creative. Invoke a persona. I'm going to share a whole bunch of ideas with you, but you didn't take notes because Farah, where are you? There you are. Farah's right there. Farah has kindly gone ahead and created a Miro board of what I'm going to share with you. And so that's going to be accessible to everybody, including the people who are watching this remotely. And you'll have it with you forever. So you can always refer to that later. So don't feel the need to record. If you see an idea that really particularly resonates with you, you'll find it later in the Miro board that FINRA created. And I've organized these around 4 different archetypes or 4 different personas. And the first one is the seeker. The seeker is a person who is interested in finding the truth, finding the answers. So the seeker is on a quest or a journey of discovery. Think of them as like a private detective, right? A private eye who's out there trying to find things. And of course, if you've ever read any books about detectives, you know that their job is to ask questions. If you want good answers, ask better questions. So as we begin to think creatively, the first thing we want to do is start to interrogate our idea or our problem space by asking better questions. One of the very best questions is this: what if? What if? Wonderful question, because it invokes possibility, right? So without any limitations, without putting any kind of constraints on it, what if this were possible? Right? So as you think about the new technologies, I know you're going to focus on generative AI. And generative AI is really very interesting because it's such a general purpose technology. It pervades almost everything, right? So it has the potential to affect every single industry. It's a great what if. What if we could apply a large language model to whatever kind of problem that you're trying to solve? So that's the first step, is opening up possibilities with a what if question. The second thing, kind of the mirror image question, is why not? Now, usually when we use this phrase, why not, it's almost in a facetious way. It's like, hey, let's go to the beach. Why not? You know, we don't really expect an answer. It's like a rhetorical question. But here, I actually want you to answer it. Why not? So if the first question is, what if we were to do this? What if this were possible? The second question is, why not? And if you answer that question quite literally, you're going to identify the obstacle, the structural impediment. That's great. That's what you're designing around, or we're designing towards. But why not? What is the reason not to proceed? Here's another question. So what? Usually when you hear someone say this, they're being sarcastic, right? You tell them about a new idea and they go, so what, right? But actually, I want you to try to use this. When you have formulated a problem definition or problem statement, or even if you've formulated an idea of a solution, start to ask the question, so what? And ask it several times, right? Hey, we've developed a new cryptocurrency that can connect people together and operate outside of national boundaries. So what? Well, that'll free people from some of the constraints and some of the friction in the current financial system. So what? Well, that means that people will be able to trade with more velocity. So what? You can get into this process of asking the question, so what? And it causes you to start to define some of the reasoning and some of the logic, some of the stuff that you take for granted, some of the stuff that might be an assumption. It starts to expose that. And that can be quite constructive. As you'll notice, I'm suggesting you do this stuff before you start to build anything. Right? These are ways to troubleshoot your idea before you've even started to code a single thing. The last question here is, what's stopping you? And again, when we ask this question, usually it's sarcastic, right? You know, someone says, hey, I'm going to go on a workout. I'm going to go get in shape. I want to go get fit. And someone says, what's stopping you? You know, they don't really expect you to answer that question. It's rhetorical. But I actually want you to think about, what is stopping you? Cool, you've identified a new idea. What's stopping you from fulfilling it? Right? And it might be budget, it might be time, it might be resource, it might be a mandate. There's a bunch of reasons, right? But if you actually list those reasons out, you're going to start to see a roadway or a pathway to delivering, a pathway to fulfillment, a pathway to realizing it. As I say, the business that I'm in is making stuff that never existed before. I have to go through this process every single time I start. If I can't answer these questions, I can't really get started. I don't have a plan. The other way to think about this is to act like a journalist. Who knows the journalist questions? Anyone know the 5 questions or 6 questions that journalists always ask? Exactly. What's your name? Michelle. So Michelle got it instantly. Clearly a journalism student or a budding journalist here. So the classic questions that a journalist will ask is who, what, when, where, why, and how. Right? You can't write the story if you can't answer those questions. And in the case of a problem definition or something that you're trying to solve, you want to answer every possible who question, every possible how question, right? So who owns the problem? Who is affected by this problem? Who might be in a position to change the circumstances around that problem? So there's a lot of who's involved in a problem statement. Where and when does it occur? Be really precise about those circumstances when this problem arises. Then the solution to the problem will arise quite naturally. And the how, well, the how, you know me, and I've already told you, the how questions are the ones that open up possibilities. They open our eyes to see things that we might not have noticed before. The how questions can be very powerful. Now, here is the ultimate question in the design thinking world. You're probably familiar with design thinking. This is a process that's been around for about 20 years from the design industry, the industrial design industry, or the human factors design business. But this is the core question that they use. Once they have a problem definition, the problem we're trying to solve is X, Y, and Z. Then they ask this question, how might we? Very simple, but profound. The how, as I mentioned, opens you up to possibilities, right? Instead of starting out with like, this is how we're going to do it, we're going to ask the question, how might we do it? And the might means it's possible, right? The might doesn't mean this is how we will do it, how we must do it, or how we could do it. It's how we might do it. It's opening up to a range of possibilities without applying critical filters. So we can encompass all the possibilities. And the we is important. That's inclusive, right? That's the whole key here. We're doing this in a collaborative fashion. So how might we? And then you add a few things to it. You add a verb and a noun and adjective, and now you've got your problem statement in the form of a question that invites people to answer it. So an example of this, I'll give you an example of it in just a second here. So there's a classic story from Toyota. Back in the days when Toyota was really making a big impact. This is the 80s and 90s, when they were really making a big impact in just-in-time delivery. They were rethinking the whole supply chain in the industrial field. And they were starting to ask themselves some serious questions. And they tried this process. In a Toyota factory in Japan, the management went out to the workers and they said, how might we increase productivity? They asked the workers of this, the workers in the factories. And of course, they got a bunch of blank stares. Like the workers are like, what? How might we increase productivity? They had no idea how to answer that question. Like, you're asking me, I work here on the shop floor. I have no idea. So you might want to reframe the question. That how might we formulation might be a little too cute. Maybe just turn it into plain English, the way they did it in Toyota. They said, how can we make your job easier? Oh, okay, now the workers had a ton of answers. They suddenly uncovered a lot of excellent solutions for making that factory way more productive just by reformulating the question. So I'm giving you these questions, and sometimes they might not fit exactly the problem that you're trying to solve. Try to reframe the question in a way, and that might unlock some further insights. As you can see, this process of asking questions or kind of interrogating the problem space is going to elicit lots of specific information if you go specific, if you go deep enough, and that'll start to help you define things in a more precise way so that you can deliver a better result. Another thing to consider is what must go. What's in the way? How's the problem being addressed right now? How do people deal with this today in the absence of the solution you're going to build? What has to make way for the new thing to be successful? In the tech industry, they used to call this the killer app. It's a little aggressive to call it the killer app, but actually, email was the killer app for postal mail. And you could say text messaging is the killer app for email, because once people adopt that, they stop using the old thing, right? So that's the idea of the killer app. So identify the thing that has to give way for the new thing, because there'll be lots of consequences to that. Usually it's not a one-for-one swap, right? Usually you're just biting off a piece of functionality, you're giving people an easier way to do that one thing. Well, then what happens to the rest of the stuff that old thing used to solve? How do those things? It might create a whole new range of problems, or it might help you think through a more holistic solution. It's a really good thing to think about. Okay, here's a funny picture. This is actually a bike that works. If you notice, the tires are all chopped up in different pieces, but you can ride this bike because there's enough of the pieces to actually make it work. On the other hand, I wouldn't argue that that's the most elegant or efficient bike. It's certainly not going to be easy to pack or put in your car. So one of the questions to ask yourself is, what's the simplest version that gives us most of the gain? It's definitely not this bike, right? There's probably a simpler version of a bicycle that'll get you the gain that you need if you just want to do your own, self-propelled vehicle. It doesn't have to necessarily look like this. In the tech world, of course, the term we use is MVP. I don't mean most valuable player. You all know this. It's the minimum viable product. But the question there is to strip it down, right? So some of the earlier questions I asked, we're going to evoke very complex answers and very detailed answers that might go into great depth. But the next phase, what you want to do is start to say, okay, well, what's the minimum set that delivers most of the value? And particularly in a week-long create-a-thon or just a few days of creating, you really want to understand this. You want to narrow it to like the minimum so that you can prove out the concept. Now, the reason we do this in the tech world is that we want to get our products in front of customers as fast as possible. Because we know that if you develop something in isolation, there's all sorts of like confirmation bias that we bring to the development process. And that confirmation bias blinds us to some of the issues that might arise from using it. And so we think it's really easy to understand. We think the interface is really friendly. We think that this is something that people will naturally adapt to. I mean, again, take a look at the crypto space, right? There are so many assumptions that the cryptocurrency companies make about user behavior, and yet very few people have adopted it yet because there are lots of impediments in the way, lots of things in the way. They haven't really got an MVP, even on like a crypto wallet yet. What's the easiest version of this thing that will get us most of the value and get us early feedback from users And then that user feedback guides the rest of the development process. The user feedback tells you what's important. Okay, here's one more idea. Some of you might know I worked for Oprah Winfrey and Anthony Robbins for a number of years. And I enjoyed working with those folks very, very much because they embrace all these possibilities. So they're great fun folks to work with. And in the process, I met a bunch of people that I would call gurus. I don't know if that's the right term. They wouldn't use that term. But people who think about personal motivation and think about inspiration and so forth. And one of these people was a young woman on the East Coast who told me this. She said, this is her technique. She asked me if I did this, and I was unfamiliar with it, but I started to do it. And I can guarantee you this actually works. This is going to sound a little weird, but trust me on this. Ask yourself a question before you go to sleep at night. So if you're working on something, maybe not during the hackathon, but maybe later in later time, you're working on a really hard problem you're trying to solve. It doesn't have to be a business problem. It could be a personal problem. But you're having a hard time figuring out the solution, right? Maybe you can't even define, you can't put your finger on what the problem itself is. Well, here's an interesting thing. If you ask yourself that in the form of a question before you fall asleep at night, your unconscious mind will continue to work on it while you're asleep. I know this sounds woo-woo. I know that sounds really weird, but it really, really works. And in the morning, when you wake up, your brain will have been working, right? So your conscious mind goes to sleep. Your brain never shuts off, right? It's running your heart and your lungs and everything else in your body while you're asleep. So the brain keeps going, and the brain loves a question. If you ask your brain a question, it's going to gnaw away and chew away at that question all night long while you're asleep. And so it's sort of like a free R&D resource that we tend to overlook. I was doing this last night. I was doing this last night. I said to myself, how can a regulator use software to, and like all night long, my brain was churning through. I woke up in the middle of the night. This is a hotel here. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I woke up with all these problems. It's like, oh, here are all the challenges around. I was like, okay, that's not the talk I'm doing tomorrow. I'm talking about solutions. But nevertheless, my brain was working right over time. And so it really does work. I know it sounds a little weird. Trust me, it will work. Here's another persona. The second persona is the persona of the alchemist. Now, you all know about alchemy, right? So alchemy, before we had modern science, you had these kind of proto-scientists who were trying to take the eye of a newt and a drop of something else and combine them together. And they were in a quest to create gold or create some other kind of substance. But along the way, almost like by accident, they invented modern physics and modern chemistry. And that led us to the modern biochemistry that we have today. So in a weird sort of sideways way, the alchemist is important because they combine elements together. So the seeker I talked about a moment ago is about asking the right question. This is about combining elements in a way that can be constructive. So this is a core principle of brainstorming. There's really two steps, diverge and converge. I'm going to talk about divergence because this is so very important to what you're going to do in the next few days. Diverging is the idea of going in many directions. That's why I have all the arrows going out. And so if you're working with a team, in the beginning, you want to diverge. You want to encourage people to diverge. That means you want people to forage around and come back with things. And you want to do that without filters. Don't apply critical filters. Just forage. Just allow people to free associate around the idea and come back with as many out there ideas as they possibly can before you apply filters. Now, I'm emphasizing that because it's so hard to do, right? It's easy to say, but it's so hard to resist the impulse to converge. This is what we're all good at, particularly at a regulatory agency with a lot of software people and a lot of business people. All of those things are things that are about applying criteria, right? Applying filters to things, narrowing things down. But the impulse to do that can actually shut down your creative impulse. So you don't want to do that right away. You don't want to start with converging. You'll get there soon enough. John Cleese, who's part of Monty Python, runs a creativity institute in the UK. And he had a really interesting observation I heard recently that got me going, got me thinking a little bit about this event. He said in business people get rewarded for being decisive. And you're identified as a potential leader if you appear to be decisive, right? So a lot of people in business put on kind of the guise of being very decisive. And part of being decisive is that you don't have any tolerance whatsoever for ambiguity. You make a decision and you move forward. And the faster you do that, the more like a leader you seem. So we get a lot of rewards in business for being decisive. But the thing about being decisive is you're actually shutting down that interval of creative thinking. You're shutting down that divergent space. You're actually shutting down the opportunity to be creative. The two don't go together. You can do them in sequence, but you can't do them at the same time. So first you have to diverge. You have to give people space to explore ideas, as nutty as they may seem, as offbeat as they might seem. You want to create a safe space for people to come up with ideas And then at mutual agreement, we can then start to apply filters and criteria and narrow those ideas down. Now, when I work with groups to do this in a company, what I'll often do is say to the group, okay, each table or each of the subgroups here, we're going to come up with 50 ideas in 5 minutes or 100 ideas in 10 minutes. And every time I say that, people are always like, no way, we can't do that. That's impossible. I've been doing this for 30 years now. And honestly, I've never had a group that hasn't been able to achieve that. If I gave everybody in this room a piece of paper, or everybody who's watching online a piece of paper and said, write down 50 ideas, you got 5 minutes, go. You could do it. Sounds hard. It's actually not that difficult to do. 50 ideas in 5 minutes, not a hard thing to do. So the point there is we're capable of doing that kind of creative divergence, but our intellect and actually the environment that we're in and the way that we're rewarded business, those cause us to apply filters prematurely. And that'll kill your creative thinking. The most creative people, according to John Cleese, are the people who can exist with the discomfort of diverging the longest. They're the people who can be open to that divergent space longer than others. They have like a kind of marathon capability, so they can be open to multiple possibilities and ambiguities and unresolved conflicts for a longer period of time, and then they start to see ideas emerging, and maybe some of those ideas turn out to be good creative ideas. People who are uncomfortable with that ambiguity, they want to rush to closure. They want to rush to a decision. Try to resist that impulse. To do that, you have to suspend judgment. And in my mind, this is like an agreement that you would strike. You would create this agreement with the rest of the people in your group. Say, okay, for the next 5 minutes, we're going to suspend judgment, which is to say, don't chime in with like a negative thing. Don't chime in with like a critical thinking thing. Don't tell us how we can't do it or why we can't do it or what the impediments are. For 5 minutes, we're going to just go open. Uncritical thinking. Sounds easy. It's hard to do. To do that, you got to strike a deal with your collaborators. So the alchemist, who's interested in collaborative outcomes and finding ways to combine people together to get better creative outcomes, the alchemist is going to start by saying, okay, what do we agree to? Before we even do anything here, what are our ground rules? One ground rule is turn off your phone. You're either in the room or you're on the internet. You can't do both at the same time. If you're on your phone, you're not participating. So let's agree to at least keep it in our pockets or in your purse and not have the phone out while you're trying to do a brainstorming session. Everybody can get away from their phone for 30 minutes. That's one. Two, one conversation at a time. Now, the larger the group, the more unlikely it is that you can keep to this. This is hard to do. So once you have more than 5 people, actually 5 is the tipping point. The 5th person starts to break off into a little side group. And so you have 2 and 3, and then from there it gets harder and harder to manage. Really important to strike an agreement at the beginning and say one conversation at a time. Why is this hard? Well, first off, people learn in different ways and they bring different perspectives. So some folks who love to rush to judgment are going to get impatient with hearing other people out. And that impatience causes them to say, okay, I got it, I understand what the person's saying. They turn to their phone, they turn to their neighbor, they turn to someone else, and they start a second thing. But the problem here is now you're not collaborating. You just broke the collaborative buzz. And so you diverged prematurely. You're breaking apart this process. Not constructive. One conversation at a time. And you want to build on each other's comments. So here is a phrase I would like you to strike from your vocabulary forever: no but. Just never say it again in your life. You'll have better relationships, you'll have a better marriage, you'll have a better time with your friends. Just never say the phrase no but. Because whatever follows that, no one's going to hear it anyway, because what you just did is contradict somebody so bluntly that they just turned off. Try this instead. Yes and. Yes and. Again, it sounds easy. It's very simple. It's hard to actually do in practice. And if you do it, it will improve your relationships at home and at work. So someone comes in, they say, hey, I've got this crazy new idea, blah, 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 blah. They start to tell you your idea. Instead of going, well, no, but you can't, try to resist that. It's so natural for us to respond that way with why that's never going to work, right? Instead, they come in, hey, I've got this crazy idea. Here's how it goes. Say, yes, and we can do the following things, right? And you just change the energy because the person feels validated. And now you're adding momentum to their joy. You're adding momentum to the buzz. You're actually collaborating. Try that. Here's another one, very simple, hard to do. Talk less, listen more. You know the old phrase, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You're supposed to listen twice as much as you talk. Good luck with that. Some people love to talk, me included. Some people talk their process, right? The only way they can think about something is to articulate it and speak it. Okay, so be self-aware. If that's your process, just say to people, hang on a second, let me talk this thing out. I need to talk it out. And if you have someone in your group who does that, well, then you can actually be a really incredibly supportive person. You can build on what they're doing by doing what they call active listening. And I've got a pen here for a reason. Active listening is where you're actually recording what they're doing. So you're watching their thought process. They're spinning ideas out. You're writing them down carefully, trying to take notes and actually creating structure around that free-flowing set of ideas that's coming from your partner. Okay, and at the end of that process, you can do something else. This is the ninja move that will build great collaborative energy in your group. Test your understanding. So your partner has been babbling away, running their sort of like stream of consciousness process, coming up with ideas, and you're not interrupting them. You're not busting their groove. You're not trying to shut them down. You're not bringing up all the critical thoughts. You're not doing any of that stuff. Instead, you're doing active listening, going, okay, sure. Yeah. Oh, great. And you're writing it down, writing it down, writing it down. And then at the end, when they're finally finished, you say, hey, let me test my understanding. Let me see if I got this straight. Let me see if I actually got what you said. And you read back what they said. Now, you're going to do a huge benefit for two groups. One, the person who spoke. Because when people are transmitting, they're clearly not recording, right? They're just flowing ideas out. And so they don't have the ability really to remember exactly what they said, but they're babbling and it might be constructive. Some of what they say might actually be really useful. And if you record it and read it back to them, you can help them understand what they said that was important. You can certainly help them understand what they said that you heard. You're going to give them really positive feedback about their communication, but that's not all. There are other people in your group who are also listening, but they might not be listening quite as attentively, right? They might not be doing active listening. Maybe they tuned out. Maybe they got bored. Maybe they lost the thread. And so if you do this, if you test your understanding and read back what you wrote, hey, let me see if I got it right. You're actually helping those other people stay on the same page. And you can see what I'm doing here is talking about how you keep the group moving together, not breaking apart into different subgroups. Now, remember, there are some people in your group who don't like to talk. Just as there are some verbal processors who love to spin their ideas out in words and just sort of babble until they get to the point, there are other people who don't do that. They don't feel comfortable. It's just not their style to speak in public. That doesn't mean they don't have good ideas. It just means that they don't talk about them so much. And so you have to create a facility for those people to express themselves non-verbally. One way to do that is with Post-it notes. Very often when you go to brainstorming sessions at work, you'll see the walls covered with Post-it notes. I'm doing an event next month in Santa Fe, and we have a whole big hallway, and we're going to post the questions in the hallway and then just leave Post-it notes so that the whole week people can start to add things. And by the end of the week, I guarantee you that entire hallway is going to be covered with Post-it notes like this picture here. As different people start to have different ideas at different times, they can add them, and you can actually rearrange them. There's a lot of things you can do with this technique. I'm sure some of you have done brainstorming techniques like that. So the room we're in right now doesn't really lend itself to this because there's no place to stick Post-it notes, but hopefully you can find a corner to do that. If you can't do it on a wall or a whiteboard, then you can always do it with 3x5 index cards in front of you. But the main thing there is create a facility for people who aren't speakers to allow them to share their ideas and contribute their ideas. You know, along with this, there's a whole process of silent brainstorming, which is where we don't talk at all. We set the rules, we agree to what we're going to think about, and then we write. And then we can share, and we can spread the information around without actually talking. That's another technique. That's another way to do this. Whatever you do, give your inner critic the day off. Just send your critic away. Now, this is going to be difficult for business people and anyone who's trained as an attorney, because in your profession, that's what you do, right? Like MBAs are fabulous at poking holes in new concepts. That's their conditioning. That's their training. They have no choice in the matter. That's what they've been raised to do. Well, you got to send that person away. Sorry, you can't be in the room because that person is going to kill the joy. They're going to stop people in their tracks. And for some folks, you have to understand, you know, if it's attorneys talking to attorneys or business people talking to business people, they're okay with that kind of aggressive pushback because that's the environment they're conditioned to. But a lot of people are not experienced with that, and they find it very intimidating, and you'll shut them down. You don't want to do that. You really want to find a way to create a safe space for people to come up with ideas. And for those who are on the receiving end, if somebody does actually speak up and step on your toes and say, oh, here's why we can't do that, that'll never work. We ask the customers, they'll never go for that, like those kinds of things. Just say, ouch, that hurt. That's all you have to do. It stops them in their tracks. You don't have to defend. You don't have to defend your idea. Just have to gently let them know that they just broke one of the rules. Hey, we have these agreements. We're going to brainstorm like this. We're going to leave your critic at home or send your critic fishing for the day, but you brought the critic into the room. Ouch, that hurts. And they won't do it again. If they do, maybe you want to ask that person to step out of the room for a bit. Seriously, protect yourself and protect your ideas and protect the integrity of the group. There's a third persona that I think can be useful, the storyteller. The storyteller, right? Every good saga has a storyteller, the blind poet, someone that holds forth, someone has a vision, right? We love to tell stories. I was talking to a minister who said, if you look at every great faith tradition, they didn't write books. They told parables. And there's a really big distinction. The parable is a simple story, almost like a myth. It's a story that can survive over generations, for centuries, over different civilizations, come to the present. And no matter what wisdom tradition you believe in, I know that you know some parables that survive many, many years, maybe centuries or even thousands of years. They endure. Storytelling is built into humanity. It's how we understand the world. The world makes no sense, right? When you wake up in the morning, you got a plan. You step out the front door, and then the world hits you in the face. And like whatever plan you had just went out the window. You're in reaction mode. That's most of us every single day, right? And then you get home at night, and you sit down for dinner with your family or friend, and you say, let me tell you what happened today. And now you start to recapitulate the crazy events of the day, and you narrate them in a style where you're structuring meaning into those experiences. So when we come home at night, we say, hey, let me tell you about today. What we're really doing is helping ourselves make sense of what was otherwise a crazy, chaotic day, where we were typically on the receiving end of a bunch of stuff that came flying at us. We're trying to create order and meaning in our life. That's what storytelling is. So the typical way to do this is to diagram the solution, right? The tech folks in the room are nodding because, of course, you all know about doing that, schematic diagrams and flow charts and so forth, process diagrams. Don't try to read that. I generated that with Midjourney, so it doesn't actually have real words. It's just a bunch of images of words. It's gobbledygook. So we start out with a diagram. But if you think about a diagram, a process diagram is a narrative. It's just a really boring narrative, right? There's a beginning, there's a starting point, and then there's a bunch of stuff that happens in the middle, and then some consequences, there's some reactions, and then something happens at the end. You get a result. So there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's just not a very good story. Write it as a narrative. User scenarios is a great practice to do in a session like this. In fact, it could be one of your final deliverables. A little story that goes along with your demo. How does someone use it? How do they find it? Where do they find it? Right? There's your journalist questions. Where, what, when, who. How did they get to this thing? How do they use it? How do they begin? What problem do they bring to it? What happens in the process? What comes out at the end? This checklist on the right is what they give fifth graders when they're teaching them how to write a story. Use this. It's actually really good. I wrote about one event. I gave details about the characters, right? That's your user. I had a beginning, a middle, and an end. I used transition words to show order. So you can actually structure your narrative in this fashion. If that's not your thing, if writing a story is not your thing, get visual. Half of our cerebral cortex is dedicated to visual input, right? We're visual creatures by nature. So get visual. In the beginning of my career, I worked with movie directors and TV directors as their creative right hand until I became a creative director and a director of my own. But at the beginning, I worked with many different directors, and some of them weren't very verbal. There was one particular director, Mark, who's a friend of mine to this day. He's great. He's a chain smoker who didn't really talk much. He kind of grunted. And so, here's the kind of direction he'd give me. I'd show up and he'd say, I want to explore it in red. I'd sit there going, what does that even mean? Red, explore it in red. Okay. So then I lived in New York at the time. I would go to all the art stores like Rizzoli, and I would look for art books that had images of any type. And I'd get a bunch of art books, I had a big messenger bag, and I would bring them back, and I would have put a Post-it note on each of the images of red that said something I thought was kind of cool. And then I would show them to Mark, and he'd sit there, nope, nope. And I'd flip the page, that. Flip the page, nope, that. And so at the end, I'd have 10 or 20 images that he said that. Honestly, this is like the level of discourse I was having with the TV director, right? But after a couple sessions like that, I knew exactly what he wanted. And then I could start to put together drawings and everything else, right? So that's one way to do it. Another director I worked with was Pam, who couldn't draw, which is actually something directors should know how to do. I used to teach at the film school at USC, and I was stunned because they didn't have a storyboarding class. They didn't teach people how to draw. I'm like, aren't we in the business of telling stories with pictures? Like, shouldn't we teach people how to make pictures? But they actually don't teach directors how to do this. And Pam had a really interesting technique. She couldn't draw, but she had a great sense of style. And so she tore pages out of fashion magazines. So every month she would go to the newsstand, again in New York, and come back with a stack of magazines. And then she would sit there and tear the pages out. She didn't smoke, but she had a folder. And then when I showed up to do work with her, she would take out her tear sheets for a particular thing, And at a glance, I could see exactly what she was looking for. And her vision was, everything from like color patterns and the set and the costumes to the framing and the lens, as well as the lighting, right? So she had a tremendous visual eye. She couldn't express it very well, but she could certainly recognize it when she saw it. So different people have different techniques, but the idea there is find your own visual technique. Try to do this. Try to put some visuals around your product idea. Now, if you can combine the two and create a storyboard, this is the ninja move. This is the thing that I think they should be teaching film directors and TV directors, and they don't. I don't know why. This is the idea of telling a story with pictures. And so draw pictures. Notice on the illustration here, they're not very good pictures. This is not an art class. You're not going to be judged on how well you can draw a human figure. That's not the point. You just want to think through clearly. Why do we do this? Because, first of all, it communicates very clearly to everyone else what your vision is, but it forces you to think through each of those stages of your process. So when we're thinking about an end user using whatever it is you're going to build during the Create-a-thon, you want to think about it as a storyboard. Draw a picture for each stage in the process. Now, the picture, if it's something that's happening on a computer, that might be a boring picture because it's the same, right? Click, click, click. You're just showing the same person clicking on a screen. Okay, so maybe you're showing something that's happening on the screen, but draw the process. Try it. Draw it as a sequence of pictures. Julian Bleecker runs the Near Futures Lab, and he built this for Nokia at a time when Nokia was the world leader in industrial design. And they go a step further. They don't just build a storyboard. They actually make the whole store, and they make the catalog. He's shown me like basically IKEA catalogs. They're not called IKEA because he's not violating copyright, but they look an awful lot like an IKEA catalog. He'll make the whole catalog, and then within that, he'll have some of his imaginary products of the future. But they're so natural in that context. They look so believable. And again, he's showing you not necessarily how people are going to use them, but how people are going to encounter them. And that's a really good thing to think through. Where do people find this? How do they tell each other about it? How do they purchase it? What kind of box does it come in? What does the box say on it? Draw the product. Draw the product on the shelf. Here's another idea. It's different from the other ones. It's not really a narrative in the sense of a linear sequence like the other ones I just described are, but it's equally useful. And it's actually something you might do at the very beginning of your process. So in the beginning, I talked about generating a lot of ideas where you're diverging. Somebody should capture those ideas, and then you try to organize them by grouping the ideas together, not necessarily in a hierarchy or sequence. Don't try to put that much structure around it just yet, but you kind of want to group them into categories or buckets, broad categories. And we call that a mind map. And that just shows you what you're dealing with. So here you can see this is somebody who's interested in going to a plant-based diet. And so what are all the things they're trying to free associate around that? Well, there's grocery shopping. How do I deal with going out to a public event? What about if I have to eat in a restaurant? All these questions that arise, and then there are little strategies around that. They're not necessarily connected. They're not necessarily exclusive to each other. They're not necessarily in a linear sequence. It's just a way to organize your thoughts, a mind map. Here's another one. Draw the competitive landscape. What's out there already? Surely whatever you're trying to solve for, someone else has tried in the past, or surely the users are using something today. So draw the competitive landscape. By the way, this is the result I got from Midjourney when because I used the generative AI, of course, right? So I went and asked it, show me a competitive landscape. And this is what it showed me. Look at this like scary kind of path through a forest with all these weird creatures looking at you and so on. But that's kind of a nice picture, right? So draw your competitive landscape. And then this is a really cool technique. This is draw your force field. So the force field, what we mean by that is when your solution or product is done and it goes into the market, it's going to encounter two kinds of forces. Forces that accelerate it and forces that are against it, that are trying to stop it. Right? So here the blue forces are the ones that accelerate, the black forces are the ones that are trying to stop it, but you can use whatever colors you want. The point is that there are opposing forces and forces of acceleration. You want to identify what those are. What are the structural impediments? What are the institutional impediments to adoption? What are the technological impediments to adoption? And then what are the things that are going to accelerate take-up? It's really important to understand this as well. This is a little bit later in the process when you have a good concept of your product, but you want to think through like, how do we deploy it? How do we get it in the hands of people? Try to draw your force field and then try to figure out how you navigate through those opposing forces and take advantage of the accelerating forces. Okay, last persona here for today. Part 4, be the builder. Okay, so far I've talked to you about being a seeker and being an alchemist and being a storyteller. But of course, we're here to make stuff, right? This is a create-a-thon. It's not just a storytelling session. We want to build things. How do builders do it? First thing, before you build anything, get clear about your emotional state. You'll notice I spend a lot of time on this, and that's because I deal with a lot of corporations, and in a lot of corporations, people are not in the ideal emotional state. And interestingly, at least speaking as a guy, guys aren't that great at articulating an emotional state. Have you noticed? I see some people nodding. Okay, so you've encountered that. It's not really a habit that we have. It's not something that we're conditioned to do. I don't know about other people, but certainly I can say that for myself. It's hard to name your emotional state, but try to do it before you start on this process. Because whatever emotional baggage you bring into the room is going to affect everybody else, and they're going to notice it for sure. They might not know what's going on in your life, but they're going to notice you're bringing some kind of funky energy into the room, and that's going to disrupt things. So try to get clear about your emotional state. If you're preoccupied, if you're stressed, if you're worried, if you're upset, disappointed, angry, those negative emotions are going to affect everybody else. So try to get clear about that, because you're unlikely to build something stable or strong if you're starting in a negative spot. And you might need to do something like go outdoors, go for a walk, get some fresh air, change your mode, change your mind. What Tony Robbins would say is change your physiology. It's one of his favorite things to say. So he's all about like, get up, stand up, move around, shake around, and if you ever go to one of his events, which I encourage you to do, they're great. He'll have people dancing, he'll have people high-fiving each other, people running around, marching outside, shouting stuff, So he really likes the idea that you can change the way you're thinking simply by changing what your body is doing. And he has some support for that, some biological support for that. Now, this is great for a regulatory agency. I can't believe I'm going to propose this, but pair up the rules. Interrogate the rules. The slogan is, if they give you ruled paper, turn the page and write sideways on the paper. So whatever rules they've given you, reconsider the rules. Ask some questions about the rules. It's okay to ask questions. Maybe here in this situation, I don't want to upset Eric. Maybe we want to stick to the rules, do whatever Eric said. But here's what I guarantee you. The organizations that you regulate, they do this all the time. They have entire teams that are focused on looking at what you folks stand for, and they're trying to figure out 24 hours a day, they're trying to figure out how they can game the regulations to get around it. You want to catch a thief, think like a thief. You want to regulate a financial business, start to think like one. And they do this all the time. They're looking for how can they stress test the envelope, find out where they can go. And certainly the crypto world, I don't think I need to get into it. Like, they don't have a rule book. Right? They're about like shred the rule book, do it in another jurisdiction, do it in cyberspace where there is no jurisdiction. So they're about like, rethink the rules completely from the ground up. There's some merit to that thinking. I'm not going to support what they're doing, but I think there is some merit to that thinking, because sometimes the rules exist just because of inertia and lassitude and a lack of imagination. And so it's okay to challenge the rules. Here's a great collaborative thing to build with. Don't try to write the whole idea yourself. It's a great exercise. Take a 3x5 card, a stack of them. Everybody at your table gets one. Write down a part of the idea. The ideal solution contains, and write down one attribute, and hand the card to the person to your right, while the person on your left passes you their card, and everybody can add another attribute. And at the end of that, look at that, you'll see there's a lot of different takes, a lot of different perspectives, because that initial seed is going to cause other people to react and respond. But it's a nice nonverbal way to do it. Pass the buck slip. You write part of the idea and leave it open for other people to add the rest of the idea. Problem definition is probably the most important thing I have to share with you today. So problem definition is the process that we do before we go into solution finding. And in the technology business, and certainly in the business world, we love to leap straight to the solution. This is a pitfall many technology companies have. Many technology companies have a piece of technology that could be useful, and so they jump straight to a solution before they properly define the problem. That is a great way to waste money and time. And they do it all the time. You see examples of this all the time. Actually, in the world of generative AI, we're seeing a ton of well-funded startup companies come forward that have a capability, but they haven't really been able to specify what problem they solve. Those companies will fail. That money will be wasted. I'm sorry to say it, but it's just true. You have to start with problem definition. Harder to do than it seems. I'm showing you Albert Einstein here because there's a story that may not be true. It may be an apocryphal story, but nevertheless, I'm sharing it with you because it's such a good story. The story goes like this. In the 1920s, Albert Einstein was the most famous scientist in the world because of his work on relativity. And so a journalist, a radio journalist, was saying, Dr. Einstein, what would you do if you only had 1 hour to solve the most difficult problem in the world? And Einstein thought about it for a second. He said, if I had 1 hour, I would spend 55 minutes on problem definition. So that story may not be true. It sounds too good to be true. But the principle, the point of it is actually quite good. Spend most of your time on problem definition. If you define the problem properly, the solutions become very evident. If you rush straight to a solution because you've got an available technology or an available resource or a coder who's particularly good at a certain thing, you're not going to solve the problem. You're going to build something. That's called solutionism. Don't jump straight to a solution. Try to really understand the problem and try to interrogate it from as many ways as possible. If you notice, about 9 out of 10 of the things I shared with you are about problem definition at the very front of the process. And I would urge you all not to embark on the process of coding anything until you have a pretty good understanding of what your problem is. To try to start with a problem statement. By the way, I'm not saying problem as like a negative thing. It's like a design problem. It's something to be solved. You have to know what you're solving for. Okay, now here is a geeky approach that's actually quite useful. You take the existing products in the market and you describe their characteristics. And so you break out those characteristics. And so here I've shown 4 products and 4 attributes, but it could be any number, right? There's no limit here. This is called a heuristic idea technique because, as at least the coders will know, a heuristic is a rule. It's just a simple rule that we can follow. And here the simple rule is basically break out each of their characteristics and then try to map them to the different products. And what you'll find is not every product has all the attributes. And that's opportunity. This is how you can find opportunity space when you find a white spot where there isn't an answer. You go, oh, there's no product that has this attribute. Or there's no product, or that particular product in the market does not address this particular thing. So try to think through existing products and start to break them down in terms of a heuristic idea technique, where you look at each different attribute and see if there are any products that actually have a gap that don't address a particular attribute. Another way to think about this is substitution. What do people do now to solve the problem that you're addressing? And surely they're dealing with it today, right? So before you go to problem definition, start by saying, what do people do right now to deal with this? I was talking to a company recently. We're working on a big data project. And we asked them about the data resources that they have, the data, how they're managing it. And they said, well, we have everything in Excel spreadsheet. They're like, but you know, like you got to start somewhere, right? And so like that was, they were very honest about it. And there's no shame. It's like, okay, we now know what we need to do. The good news is they haven't messed anything up. They have it. It's just like, wow, okay, that's the tool they're using today. Well, the substitution process says, okay, what happens if you take that tool away? What else would they use? And then take that tool away. What else would they use? Okay. So what that shows you is that, first of all, people are incredibly inventive. They have a lot of ingenuity, and they'll come up with different ways to solve a problem. It also causes you to go back a little bit in time to like a time before we all had computers on our desktops. How did we do it in the past? What was the technique? Why did we do that? What were the right ways to do things in the back in the day? So if you think about the process of substitution by taking away today's solution and the one that preceded it and the one that preceded that, you start to get to some pretty core attributes that you'll need to have in your solution. You start to come up with a checklist. Whatever we develop must do the following things, because historically, that's what all of these other solutions have done in the past. One more way to think about this is to solve the opposite problem. Let's suppose you're trying to solve a problem, but answers are not forthcoming. So you've got a decent problem definition, but you're not having a really huge amount of success with your team at coming up with solutions that are grabbing anybody, getting them excited. Well, one way to deal with that is to solve the opposite problem, right? So how might we increase productivity without raising our costs? Okay, well, flip it around. How might we decrease productivity and increase our cost, right? All of a sudden, it's quite easy to say, oh, here's all the stuff that you would do to do that, right? So that actually breaks the logjam, and you can start to generate a lot of ideas, and then you can just look at that and say, all right, what are the opposites of these? How can we work against them? One of my favorite things to do, headlines from the future. Suppose that your solution works. Suppose it's widely adopted. How will that change the world? This is a bit like scenario planning, right? So you're forecasting here. You're saying, okay, in a circumstance where this idea is widely adopted, our project is a success, and the CIO says, okay, great, it's going to go into our innovation program. This is going to be one of our R&D projects. Yay, and then it actually becomes a real product, a real tool that's used by FINRA. How will that change the world? How will that change the financial industry? I think this is a really important technique, right? You start out with the idea of, okay, it worked. How did it change the financial industry? And work your way back. Now, in my line of work, in scenario planning, we call this backcasting. Everybody knows about forecasting, right? Forecasting is where you take an existing trend that we all agree with, yep, that's an obvious trend, and then we kind of project it forward into time. It never quite works that way because different trends intersect, so the outcomes get to be kind of a cone of possibility. It's not like there's one straight outcome. You can't just do linear extrapolation from today's trend. That's forecasting. Backcasting is the opposite. Backcasting is where we identify scenarios in the future So we say, okay, let's think about future states. Possible future state number 1, future state number 2, future state number 3. And we work our way back and say, what things must be true for future state number 1 to occur? And when you identify those things that must be true, those are usually developmental objectives, like goals that you're going to try to solve for. And some of them may contain their own set of problems that you have to solve in order to reach the next one. Some people call this the adjacent possible in the complexity field. That's the term that they use. So the idea there is each time you solve a problem, it opens up a whole range of new possibilities. And within each of those possibilities, there's new problems to solve. When you solve those, it opens up even more possibility. That's why when we project the future, it's actually a cone. It's not a linear line. It's not a straight line on a chart. It's an ever-expanding cone of possibility. But you can actually work the other way. You can start out with the future scenario and work your way back and identify the key milestones that must be true. It's a really useful technique for forecasting. Last thought for you today, be curious. I want to encourage everybody here to enter this process with maximum curiosity. Ask questions about the process, be open to possibilities. It's been my pleasure chatting with you. I'm Rob Tercek, the author of Vaporist, and I've enjoyed talking to you today. If there are any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. And if not, I will happily relinquish the floor back to your team. Thank you.